Hey, everybody, and welcome to the next lecture, Engines of Change, the Industrial Transformation of America, basically from 1800 to 1850. Um, and this is a pretty straightforward lecture, just a lot of information here about the period. We're not really talking about massive political ideas or anything like that, so this should not take a tremendously long amount of time to get through, but I did want you to have access to this information coming from me. Now, obviously, it's in your book as well. So, I think it goes without saying that, the United States has been a hotbed of innovation for since our existence, essentially. And that doesn't change in this period. I mean, throughout the history of the United States, that we've always had massive innovations. And so that's going to continue throughout history, but certainly in this era where we're going to get the first sort of industrial revolution that we're going to have here in the States. And you're going now, I want to caution. America still is large, a large chunk of America is still agricultural based and rural. And we will be for quite some time. It's really not until post World War II that we start to see a transition towards more white collar jobs and more industrial jobs and things like that. But we still have a deep history of agriculture in the United States. Certainly in the 1700s, we are a very rural and agricultural community, and also what you consider a artisan community. Now, the word artisan, if you buy something today and it's artisan, it's usually associated with being, handmade and usually more expensive. Well, we're going to transition from that into more of an industrial and a market-driven economy during this period. So we're going to see more mass production and more standardization. um, People are going to start, and it sounds crazy, but people are going to start dressing more alike because you're going to start ordering things from catalogs and you're going to start seeing people get the same clothing as opposed to maybe making it at home themselves where everybody's wearing something different. Um, this is capitalism developing in the United States, and new uh, technologies are going to shape the way we work, how we work society, and also the class structure, especially in the North. The South stays relatively stagnant in its class structure. You have the elite slave owners up here, then you have a very, very, I don't want to say small, but it is a very tiny middle class, mostly in cities like Savannah and New Orleans. That'd be shopkeepers and things like that, hotel owners. And then you have a large poor white class, and then obviously the massive slave population. Now, early on in the industrialization in the Northeast, the first system of production was called the putting out system. Now, stop your snickering, it has nothing to do with that. The putting out system basically saw merchants would go to families, often in rural areas, and they would give them the resources, the lumber, etc., and they'd say, "Build me some tables so I can go sell some tables." Whatever it was, sew me some clothes so I can go, I can go sell these clothes. What this means is that every piece that was built was somewhat unique, um, and it was, uh, no standardization was there. And this is really not efficient either because you're having to get the raw materials, get them to these families. They're then going to produce them, then you have to get them back to your shop. So it's not a efficient way to run an economy. But this is decentralized production uh, that will later lead to the development of factories, which is then going to decrease labor costs because you're going to start seeing the employment of immigrant laborers, especially in the Northeast. Mills were very important, obviously. And so Samuel Slater is known for establishing some of the first uh, mills in the United States. And it was, how do I say it? He basically stole things from Great Britain. He would uh, I'm not talking about, oh, sorry, I should be clear. It's not grain mills. These are textile mills, fabric mills. And so basically, Slater went to England and kind of stole the blueprints and memorized blueprints and maybe stole some parts, came back to America, said he created all this stuff, and you get the very first mills starting in the 1790s in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And so it's, yeah, it's industrial theft and espionage or whatever. But it does mean that no longer does American cotton have to go to England to be processed. It can now be more efficiently processed here in the United States. Um, this is going to lead us to the Rhode Island system, which is still going to be family based, but it's going to be more in a factory. So families would work in these factories. These are going to be smaller scale mills, but we're getting our way to the larger textile mills that will come to define the Northeast later on. Now, in the Lowell mill system, you're going to see women are going to be employed by these larger mills. And it was so I'm still wearing the Stone Cold shirt. Uh, it was basically if you were a young woman and you hit a certain age, you were either expected to find a man to marry and get out of the house, or you had to contribute to the household. And this is where the Lowell Mill system comes into play. The Lowell Mill system takes young immigrant women and it employs them. They live in boarding houses by the mills. They earn money. They send that money back to their families. They keep a little bit of it, but they send most of that money back to their families. And while they're working in these mills, in these towns, they're also searching for a husband. So, this is not necessarily female empowerment. This is still very patriarchal. Women are being used for this labor, though. So, women are key to the labor force, working the looms and everything else, the mills. But they are doing so with this idea that eventually they'll be married off and they can leave the mill and all this fun stuff. With it comes all the normal abuses and everything else that happens when you have young women, especially young immigrant women or these sort of rural women that are going to a city for the first time. Those abuses that come along with that are not great. But again, we are moving toward this idea of expanded uh, expanded production through these more modernizing industrial mills of the period. And as time goes on, there will be mechanization that will start to take hold. Um, one mill where people would go to work could outproduce thousands of home weavers. And part of that is when you're at home working, there's all sorts of distractions, but it's just not as efficient either. The mills could keep up to date with the technology. So as you had more mechanized systems, a mill can house that, which you couldn't house at a home. And so the area of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, the New England region, essentially becomes a hub of American commerce, but it's relying on slave labor as well, because the cotton they're using at these mills is coming from the South in slave labor, that necessary evil that we talked about. Um, Now, we're going to start to develop a vibrant capitalist republic, and that land laws and there's going to be speculation are going to drive people into the West, into the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region. Now, speculation is very, very dangerous. Speculation is when someone would buy land assuming that it would be worth more money in the future. Sometimes this paid off. Down here in areas like Oklahoma and things like that, if you speculated on land, you discovered oil. Now, of course, we're talking about the early 1900s here. That's a type of speculation. You see speculation still in major cities. If you see someone, buy, like for instance, here in Tulsa, In the last few years, a lot of people started buying up homes in certain neighborhoods that would traditionally be viewed as lower income neighborhoods, but as gentrification has started to take hold, you buy a home for 75, $80,000, the neighborhood starts to change in a few years. That home and that land alone could be worth double or triple what you did. That's speculation. Um, it's got different names that we use in modern times, like house flipping. But at this time, it was about land out in the West. And again, we're talking about the West over to the Mississippi, not past that yet. Yes, we've had the Louisiana Purchase, but we're not quite going that far yet with these speculations. And these land offices would buy up all this land. They would just try to sell it to people. And sometimes it worked out and sometimes it didn't. Um, Now, if you could put enough money together to buy land and get a semi-successful farm, it was probably better than being an immigrant laborer in the city. But we do, with comes financial successes, comes downtimes. And now we call them recessions and depressions. We used to call them panics. And in 1890, the speculative bubble burst. And coupled with the Brits overproducing too much, so American goods were too cheap to be profitable because the Brits, we were trying to trade with Great Britain, but they had overproduced. So their goods that were homegrown and homemade were super cheap in Britain, but they were also super cheap in the United States. There's also not good banking practices. I mean, we're on a gold and silver standard. There's only so much gold. They were not able to give out loans. People couldn't develop their financial backing. And then these lands that people had invested all their money in that were proving to be worthless or people didn't have the money to buy them leads to this big burst. And what you get from this is you have a lot of people default on their loans. That leads to businesses and farms going out of business or foreclosed on. That leads to unemployment. And then we get some of our earliest attempts of government intervention, although not on any major scale, in the Relief Act of 1821, which saw the government start to try to back some lower interest loans to people that needed them at the time. But it is a part of the capitalist nature that these type of things will have an ebb and flow. We prefer to have slow and steady growth, but people don't necessarily like slow and steady growth. That's where you get things like speculation, where people think they can make a lot of money really quick. That's far more appealing than sitting there and slowly watching your bank account grow. You want to see that big old spike. So, now, other inventions during this period, Eli Whitney, most people remember Eli Whitney and the cotton gin. Eli Whitney unwittingly made slavery incredibly profitable. What the cotton gin does is it basically separates the seeds from cotton. Now, there are two types of cotton. There's long staple and short staple cotton. And short staple cotton is a lot easier to grow, but it tended to be a lot seedier, meaning there were more seeds in it. The cotton gin removes those seeds, and when they were able to grow this short staple cotton, the South could produce a lot more cotton, use the cotton gin to remove the seeds, as opposed to having the slaves have to manually remove the seeds, which was time consuming, which meant there could be more cotton production, thus making cotton profitable. Unwitting. Robert Fulton, he also invents interchangeable parts. That is Eli Whitney. Very great concept. Ford will be known for this throughout most of the 1900s, where you can take a part from a car that was built, well into the 1950s and 60s. Like you can take a part from a Ford truck from, 62, and you could put it on a Ford truck from 66, interchangeable parts. The idea is to making standardization in the production of mechanized equipment. Robert Fulton invents the steamboat. Hey, we no longer have to worry about using oars or wind or whatever. We can easily go up and down the Mississippi River. It's a lot easier to deal with navigation. And then Cyrus McCormick creates the mechanical reaper. There's all sorts of other things that are developed during this period. Something as simple, John Deere's first invention was a steel plow that replaced the iron plow. There was the seed drill, which the seed drill will become very prominent once we expand into areas like Oklahoma and Kansas. Whenever the ground was really dry, seed drills would puncture the ground, plant the seeds further down to where it was wet enough for the seed to take root and grow. All these inventions are going to see more production here stateside, and it's going to decrease our reliance on having to get things from overseas. And this is what's going to allow the United States to become pretty insular in the 1800s, where we don't really have to rely on Europe very much. And so we can stay out of those foreign entanglements because we don't need them. Well, as you produce more things, you got to move more things. And that's where we get canals and the development of roads. Uh, Here in America, in the 1950s, we developed the interstate highway system, and that was largely done for military transportation in the case of some sort of catastrophic war. But I mean, you think about our roadway system and highways and turnpikes and everything else. Roads were very rudimentary at the period in this time in America, and having a good road that wasn't going to destroy your products from being, too rough was very important. I do suggest you go look on a map where the Cumberland Road is and the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal, create not a big canal, but it was big enough for the day because they weren't using giant ships or anything. Connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, and it allowed stuff to get to the Atlantic Ocean a lot easier. We're increasing the availability and speed of delivering goods from the western part of the United States to the eastern part of the United States. Now, the South will lag behind in all of this. Um, and Especially when it gets to railroads. Railroads were so vitally important. Um, and the North had a massive railway system, not massive by modern standards, but they had a much bigger railway system than the South because they were getting goods from the West to the factories, and they developed railroads. And this is going to play a major part in the Civil War because the North's going to have this rail system where they can transport weapons and troops a lot quicker than the South can, who still has these old dirt roads and no real railway system to speak of. So we don't often think about it. We often probably think about trains when they're annoying us by being in our way, but they are vitally important to the transfer of goods and services in the United States, even today. Um, there's lots of problems with railroads today, but they are still massively important. Well, with all this innovation and everything else, you're going to have a rise of economic uh, changes, and you're going to see a rise of different social classes. Industrialists like Junius Morgan, uh, they're going to inherit wealth and create new industries. You're going to start to see the development of what we consider a more modern class structure, where you have those elite industrialists and merchants up on top. You start to see a development of a middle class through businessmen and small entrepreneurs who maybe innovated something. Um, and it's really that middle class that's going to shape of a lot of American values. I talked about Republican motherhood in our last lecture. They're going to be instrumental in that idea that women are there to create good little citizens and everything else. And the working class or the poor class, I mean, they're dealing with massively low wages, health hazards, long hours. There are all sorts of horrible, horrible things that they are having to deal with in these early factories in the United States. And it is a very, very horrible situation for them. Now, part of what depresses wages is that there is going to be an influx of Irish and German immigrants in this period. The potato famine in Ireland, especially, brings over hundreds of thousands of Irish, and they all go to the Northeast and they start working at these factories. And because these are not skilled jobs, they are easily replaceable, and so they're not paid much. Now, this used to be the case with like fast food workers in America. Fast food places would pay minimum wage and they would have no trouble getting employees because everybody wanted a job to make some money. It was only recently after the pandemic where people were like, yeah, maybe you should pay me some more money. Um, but the overflow of abundance of labor means that there are going to be low wages, poor conditions, because who cares if that guy gets hurt? There's no workman's comp, there's no workplace insurance, there's none of that. If, Patty O'Malley loses his arm, okay, bring on Seamus O'Toole, whatever. I'm just making up names, obviously. Just go get that guy off the street, replace him. Sorry, Patty, you don't have an arm anymore. Sucks. Go try to live. There's nothing there. There's just nothing there. But also, this influx of immigrant workers starts to lead to a nativist fear. And they're going to start seeing tension between the people that we call white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, WASPs, and these quote unquote immigrants. Now, putting aside that every white person in the United States is clearly an immigrant, and many of which are less than a few decades of being immigrants, they are already creating this cycle of fear of foreigners. In the 1850, it's going to be fear of the Irish, to a lesser extent, fear of the Germans. After the Civil War, it's going to be fear of Italians. Later, it's going to be fear of Jews. There's always going to be a fear of Catholics. There's going to be later a fear of people coming in from Slavic regions. And it just cycles and cycles and cycles. By the time we get to the 1870s and 80s and the Italians start to come over in bigger droves, the Irish, who were discriminated against in the first half of the 1800s, are discriminating against the Italians. And this is just a cycle that has happened in American history. We often think about race relations or ethnic relations as being white versus black. That is not solely the case. It is a major part of our race relations and ethnic relations in America, but it is not solely that. We've seen it recently with a rise in anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was a major part of American history. There were people when Hitler and them were in power who were like, oh, the Nazis aren't so bad, and while we don't necessarily see it as much today, throughout American history, there has always been sort of a fear of Catholicism. JFK, despite the fact that there were millions upon millions of Catholics, JFK is the first Catholic president. And it took until the 1960s for that to happen because people thought if we elected a Catholic president, that somehow the Pope would run the United States. This industrialization, though, in this period of America greatly changes who we are. It starts to make us start to be a power, to start being taken seriously. And it leads to this deep, deep history and tradition of American innovation and that idea of the American work ethic, the idea that Americans work harder. Now, we may not 100% believe that today because our economies are all different and everything else, but you never heard anyone mention the British work ethic. It was a uniquely American thing in the early 1800s. Well, that was an easy peasy lecture here for you guys, just talking about some facts. There will be a lecture outline attached to it in the lecture outlines. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Remember, Monday we'll have a lecture, and then you will have a take-home exam that I will post on Tuesday. You guys, it's a pleasure teaching you every week. Oh no, not Monday, Tuesday for you guys. Your exam will be posted on Wednesday. But it's a pleasure teaching you guys every week, and I hope you have a great day. Peace out.